Tu connaissais la chanson avant? Non. Juste il y a 4 notes.
I think you'll learn Bezat Hashem.
Juste écoutez déjà.
Toda
Yeah,
Rabba,
it's okay.
Rabba.
Straight. Have a nice mood.
Toda Rabba, Baruch Hashem.
Bye-bye.
Shalom, shalom, everyone who's joining us on the stream, live on YouTube. We are here for another weekly installment of our limud of the Parshat Shavua. As always, rooted in the words of Chief Rabbi Pinchas Eliyahu Shaddai. From our weekly pamphlet, The Words of the Chief Rabbi. I will start my screen share in a second, and we will dive right in. Toda Rabbah for everyone's patience and flexibility and presence due to having some technical difficulties earlier that Baruch Hashem have been swiftly resolved. Someone entering. Shalom, shalom. Welcome, Reverend Yocheved. Toda Rabbah for joining. Just pulling up the share screen so we can dive into the text. Here we go. All right. I am now sharing the screen. Baruch Hashem. So again, we are in Parsha Emor, our weekly portion, according to the words of the Chief Rabbi Pinchas Eliyahu Shaddai. It begins, understanding the rabbinic stance on Shabbat and the Moadim. Parshat Emor focuses primarily on the laws of purity and holiness, first for the spiritual leaders, the Kohanim, the priests, and then for the entire nation through the Hebrew calendar. That's already an important distinction, an important emphasis on that delineation. One of its most famous sections presents the calendar festivals known as the Moadim by enumerating the annual cycle of Jewish holidays. Shabbat, recalled as the foundation of the holiness of time. Pesach, Passover, the festival of deliverance. The counting of the Omer, which corresponds to the 7-week countdown between Pesach and Shavuot. Shavuot, which commemorates the giving of the Torah and the offering of the first fruits. Rosh Hashanah, marked by the sounding of the shofar. Yom Kippur, a day of atonement and fasting. And finally, Sukkot, with Shemini Atzeret, which celebrate the festival of booths and the final joy, Simchat Torah. The term Moed, often translated as festival or appointed time, actually signifies, in a profound reading, a meeting point between human time and a specific spiritual dimension. From a spiritual perspective, according to the Zohar, Sefer HaBahir, and the Arizal, a Moed is not merely a commemorative date, but a recurring energetic window where a specific divine light reveals itself anew in the world. So that's important to emphasize. All of the Moadim are each reflective of and embodiments of, and I'll add through memorialization, they are remembrances and even reenactments of the specific configuration of light, which in this case refers to the mohim that flows down through these specific windows in time, through these auspicious times, the appointed times. And each of the festivals are also likened to a specific configuration of the reunification as rectification in the Yehud of Zeranpin and Nukva, Tiferet and Malkut, the lower seven Sefirot, as the reconciliation and rectification of the 7 days of the week, the 7 flows of Shefa, the 7 planetary influences. And by correcting the times through these memorializations, through the kavanot, through the mitzvot associated with these festivals, the entirety of the cosmos essentially is rectified by our efforts and intentions. The Zohar explains that each festival corresponds to a particular manifestation of the Sefirot. The Bahir introduces the idea that time is not linear, but structured in spiritual cycles where certain gates open at precise moments. Another important thing to note is the concept of what I typically call the divine simultaneity of our Creator, our limitless Creator, even to the revelation to Moshe with the name Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the divine simultaneity of I am that I am, I will be that which I will be, I have always been that which I will always be, and so on and so forth. The eternal and limitless unity and unification of presentness, being, is, am, are, be. The divine simultaneity of understanding that we are always our ancestors. Past, present, and future converge constantly and cyclically are always so inextricably interrelated. So at the same time we delineate sacred windows of time, we also enact and evoke the very transcendence that occurs in understanding that unity of these times. And that each of the festivals is a reflection of the Shabbat itself or herself. The Shekinah restored, rectified, Malkut rectified, and elevated to become that Carmelit, that Gan Eden, that Pardes, where there is no separation. The Ari HaKadosh further develops this by teaching that the same spiritual flows revealed during the original event, such as the Exodus from Egypt or the giving of the Torah, descend each year, allowing man to actively reconnect with these forces. Toda Rabbi, shalom, shalom, Rabbi Ariel. Toda Rabbi for joining. Thus, a moed is a cosmic appointment ordained by God, during which the world is more receptive to a given spiritual quality. From a modern scientific or conceptual perspective, a moed can be understood as a temporal cycle synchronized with natural and psychological rhythms. The calendar is lunisolar, aligning the festivals with both lunar phases and seasonal cycles, thereby creating points of biological, emotional, and social coherence. It can also be interpreted as a system of periodic resonance. At regular intervals, certain conditions, collective, symbolic, and ritual, recur, fostering specific states of consciousness. Introspection on Yom Kippur, for example, collective joy on Sukkot, liberation on Pesach. One moment. All right, Toda Rabah. Thank you for your patience. Please let me know if the text on the screen is still visible. All right, Toda Rabah. In this sense, a moed functions as a temporal attractor, a moment when human experience synchronizes with deeper structures of time, reinforcing memory, identity, and inner transformation. Let us explore the architecture of time within rabbinic and Kabbalistic thought, drawing on the teachings of the Sefer HaKaneh, the Rambam, and the Ramban, in order to define the complex relationship between the lunar cycle and the status of Shabbat. The statement of the Sefer HaKaneh, attributed to Rabbi Nehunia ben HaKaneh, Pesach Shabbat Hi, Pesach is a Shabbat, is not an emotional metaphor, but a precise halakhic classification. In this framework, the term Shabbat defines a higher legal category associated with the spiritual state of Binah, the realm of freedom from which both the weekly seventh day and the festivals, Yamim Tovim, draw their essence. This structural identity explains why the Torah refers to many Moadim as Shabbaton, or even uses the term Shabbat to designate the first day of Pesach. For the Kaneh, the festivals are 7 special Shabbatot, corresponding to the 7 divine emanations, Sefirot. Okay. So to continue the text, corresponding to the 7 divine emanations, Sefirot, functioning as way stations where the suspension of judgment, Din, legally mandates the cessation of all melacha, creative work. Emphasis on creative work. On the level of halakhic application, just one moment, I think someone is entering the room. Toda Rabah, Rabbi Shula, Toda Rabah for joining. I go right back in the text. On the level of halakhic application, the Rambam confirms this unity by establishing that all labors prohibited on Shabbat are equally forbidden during the festivals, with the sole exception of food preparation, ochel nefesh. Consequently, Yom Tov is legally a derivative level of Shabbat. It shares the same system of prohibitions, but with an open valve for vital needs. The Ramban, however, clarifies a fundamental distinction in rabbinic posture. Shabbat possesses a fixed holiness, kiviyah vekaima, established by God since creation, whereas the Moadim depend on human sanctification via the lunar calendar, Mikadesh Israel Hazmanim. Man thus utilizes the lunar cycle, astronomical determination, to confer the legal and spiritual status of Shabbat in its legal nature upon a specific day. Yet, despite this technical link, the rabbinic posture maintains an absolute and insurmountable distinction between the two cycles. Contrary to certain marginal or sectarian theories throughout history, rabbinic tradition categorically rejects the idea of a lunar Shabbat, where the seventh day would follow the phases of the month, the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. Shabbat is an autonomous metaphysical rhythm of 7 days that must not depend on any celestial body, thereby asserting the supremacy of the divine order over the natural order. To align the two would be to nullify the specificity of Shabbat as a testimony to creation ex nihilo. In short, the wisdom of Israel achieves this unique synthesis. The festivals reach their peak during the full moon, the moment when spiritual light becomes the cosmic expression of Shabbat, while the weekly rhythm remains the immutable heart of time, totally independent of celestial revolutions. Okay, continuing with the text. Understanding the Bantu Israelite determination to link Shabbatot, Moadim, and lunar phases for the liberation of the Black man. How to put an end to the cancer of human history called racism, negrophobia, mockery, theft, plunder, murder, apartheid, slavery, colonization, acculturation, imposed on Black peoples under the pretext that we bear the color of a curse, the color of the devil. For Bantu Israelite sages, heirs to the Torah of the 10 tribes of Israel, considered by them to predate rabbinic Torah, language itself preserves a deep spiritual structure. In Kikongo, depending on the dialect, Kisikongo, Kiyombe, Kimaniaga, the number 7 is generally expressed as Nsambu or Sambu, while rest is Pema or Mpema, and the verb to rest is Kupema, literally meaning to breathe again. In Lingala, a very similar structure appears. 7 is Sambo, rest is Bopemi, and the verb is Kopema. The phonetic proximity between Sambu, Sambo, Shabbat, and even Samba, to pray, to invoke, opens the way to a coherent etymological and spiritual reading within the Bantu Israelite framework. Indeed, terms such as Nzambi, God, Ein Sof Baruchu, Sambo, 7, and Kosambela, to pray, share a common root, Sam, Zam, with natural phonetic variations between S, Z, and Nz, which are typical in Bantu languages. The root conveys the idea of relationship with the divine, of entering into connection with a higher reality. In this framework, Nzambi, Ein Sof, is understood as the one toward whom one turns. Kosambela, or Kozambela, Konzambela, depending on pronunciation, as the act of turning toward him, and Sambo, 7, as the moment when that connection is fulfilled. The number 7 thus becomes the culmination of a cycle, the point at which activity is suspended, Pema, in order to enter into a vertical relationship. Rest is therefore not merely physical, but intrinsically linked to prayer. One stops in order to reconnect with Nzambi and Self-Baruku. This structure takes on its full meaning when connected to lunar terminology such as Ingoda, Kikongo, or Sanza, Lingala, which refer both to the moon and to the month. The moon is perceived as a visible cosmic clock, a reflection of the divine in the world. It structures time in cycles of approximately 28 days, that is, 4 periods of 7. Sambo, Zambo, Nzambo. Each lunar phase marks a transition in time, and these moments, particularly the new moon and the full moon, are traditionally associated with periods of rest, pemi, and prayer, kosambela. The moon thus becomes the guide that leads to 7, and 7 becomes the threshold that calls for connection with Nzambi and Self-Baruku. From this emerges a profound coherence. Nzambi is the source. Ngonda, the moon, is the regulator of time. Sambo, 7, marks the completion of the cycle. Pema, rest, is the necessary suspension. And Kosambela, to pray, is the act that gives meaning to that pause. In this vision, language itself preserves the memory of an integrated spirituality in which cycle, rest, and prayer are not separate, but form a single movement of return to the divine source, structured by the phases of the moon. Accordingly, Bantu Israelite wisdom, especially in its oldest forms rooted in direct observation of the sky, rests on a deeply integrated vision of reality in which cosmology, metaphysics, and social organization are one. Within this framework, the concept of a day of rest aligned with the moon is not a mere cultural rule, but a fundamental principle. Human beings are not separate from nature. They must attune themselves to it like an instrument to a frequency. Time is neither abstract nor conventional. It is experienced as a cosmic breath, and the role of humanity is to synchronize with it. At the heart of this logic lies the notion of vital force, order and self, often expressed through the concept of Intu. In this philosophy, everything that exists is animated by flows of energy in constant circulation. The moon plays a central role in this dynamic, as it is perceived as a regulator of fluids. It influences tides, biological cycles, fertility, and even plant growth through the movement of sap. So much could be said. Bantu Israelite sages, seen as guardians of the primordial Torah, observed that certain lunar phases, particularly the new moon and the full moon, correspond to moments of transition in which energetic balances are unstable or shifting. During these periods, working the land, digging, cutting, or producing is perceived as a form of aggression against the system in transition. Rest then becomes not only a spiritual necessity, but also a protective one, allowing these flows to remain undisturbed and preventing the depletion of vital force, both individually and collectively. This also reminds me, there are certain cultural beliefs and customs that say you shouldn't cut your nails, your fingernails, or your hair during certain moon phases. Again, we are always to honor the synergy and synchronicity with nature, being one with it and not seeking to dominate it. This approach is rooted in a deeply cyclical conception of time. Unlike a linear model in which days follow one another uniformly, the time of the B'nai Congo is structured by phases of renewal. Through its visible cycle of disappearance and reappearance, the moon becomes the most reliable and sacred clock. And it's interesting how these feminine structures of time, cycles, Gilgul, circles, Eagle, the Eagulim, the Gilgulim, the cycles and seasons of time when following this spiraling model exemplified by the moon, it's an interesting juxtaposition even when you think of the hormonal ecology of physical man and woman. The woman's hormonal ecology is very cyclical. The woman has cycle seasons, different phases, just as we have 4 seasons. There are 4 seasons, the inner spring, summer, winter, and autumn of the ovulatory cycle, or otherwise the cycle of Nidah, versus the man's hormonal ecology that, like the sun, rises and sets consistently every single day, the same time, the same way, in this linearity. So we know that when we speak about the language of Choshek, the language of darkness, the language of the back, the Akoraim, the language of what is hidden, that is also the inner dimension, the dimension of femininity, the realm of the firstborn. And we know that what is most inner is most high. What is most hidden is higher. And so we as B'nai Congo, we as the people of the Choshek, melanated people, we as the people of the back, in many levels, and in literally and figuratively, socially, politically even, we have traditionally kept sacred this lunar model, this cyclical model, and this innate understanding of that divine simultaneity. Us as our ancestors, always connected to this circle of life, always connected to the understanding that even our children, our ancestors reborn, these things that are common in our language, in our colloquialism, in our everyday communication. When in our communities we see a baby and say, oh, that's a little grandma, that's a grandma baby. You know, being able to identify which ancestor has returned. That looked like Uncle such and such. Identifying those markers, those traits, those character traits, even those physical characteristics that evoke and invoke the spirit of a particular ancestor, and honoring that divine simultaneity. Phases of renewal. There's so much language nowadays about burnout culture. The idea of working this, what we call rat race, this system of westernization, globalization, capitalism, maybe, and being expected to just go the same time, the same way, every day, like a machine, for the system, until you literally burn out, depleted of vital force, ordained self, the Ashe. And everything in this society and industrialization is to disconnect us from that vital force, disconnect us from those ancestral roots that connect us with nature. Even when we talk about the medical industry, all these things are about taking you out of those sacred times and spaces to honor the phases of renewal. But fortunately, in our tradition, in our Torah, we have these feasts to bring us back to that, even with Tu B'Shvat, and connecting with the different fruits, connecting with the 7 kings, connecting with the moon and the sap and the seasons of growth, planting seeds and harvesting. This is how we come back to that ancestral memory, that ancient memory and that natural synergy. So the moon, which is our Shekinah, which is our Shabbat, which is Malkut, becomes the most reliable and sacred clock. It embodies a constant principle. Just 1 second. Plug in the laptop in. It embodies a constant principle of death and rebirth. In certain readings among the B'nai Moshe, there's also the idea that a human being can become permeable to forces of disorder. A person who lives in deception, excess, or irresponsibility may gradually lose inner clarity. One would then say that they are caught in a dynamic that exceeds them. This is not necessarily framed in terms of sin in the Western sense, but rather as a form of capture by imbalance, where the person is no longer fully aligned with life. The spiritual implications of this condition are profound. First, there is an impact on vital force. Disordered sexuality is understood as a dispersion of energy, a loss of centeredness. Second, there is a disruption between the visible and the invisible. Since the ancestors and the living are in relationship, moral rupture disturbs that connection. In traditional understanding, this may manifest as a loss of peace, recurring conflict, blockages, or a sense of being disconnected from blessing. This also brings to mind in this portion the sanctification of the Kohanim. Last week, we spoke about Aharon, Kohen Gadol, and the extreme purity embodied where he merits being able to enter that most holiest portal, that mercy seat, to stand before the mercy seat, to be in the divine presence, to enact that Yikud with Shekinah. And here in Parsha Emor, all of the Kohanim, their purity is described. The cost of that purity, what and who they can and cannot touch, who they can and cannot marry, the integrity required to be that intermediary. So Parshat Emor is very much about understanding that even the halakhic mandate that the priest must marry a virgin, we have to keep in context, first of all, that the Betula is the embodiment of a Malkut that is restored, a Malkut that is rectified, a Malkut that has not been mixed. We spoke last week about the Irbuv, that chaotic mixture of confusion, versus the harmonization of unification in Kedusha. Oneness, wholeness, shalom. When we have that admixture of confusion, even that admixture of doubt, which can go into the Mishnah of Peah and Demai, but that's another story. But the idea of mixing brings to mind even the idol, the abomination in the temple, defiling the sanctuary, defiling the Shekinah, defiling the Shabbat, bringing in the idols, bringing in the Avodah Zarah. The mixture and confusion, the irbuv, the mess that comes from the manipulation of the calendars, the manipulation of the times, the manipulation of the divinity, I'll say, of the natural functions of the body and the mind. Because even the text here spoke about the psychological rhythms, the natural and psychological rhythms that we must be attuned to, and that we are reminded to be attuned to through the keeping and fulfilling of these Moedim. My apologies. Let's find where we are in the text again. The sense of being disconnected from blessing, the sense even of being disconnected from the flows of Shefa, the 7 flows of Shefa from the Shekinah that we also talked about last week. Not being in that spiritual state of Eretz Israel, as we delineated, not being in that spiritual state of Israel, the spiritual dynamic, the spiritual consciousness and embodiment, the intentional embodiment of that purity as signifying the restoration of the temple. Thus, the Kohen must be matched because of the purity of his vessel with the pure vessel that is Betulah, representing the restored Malkut, the rectified Nukla. And there is a spiritual and a physical quality of virginity. That may be a conversation many are not ready for yet. But when we speak about restoring the temple, we also notice in this portion the emphasis on Ma'aseh Merkavah, Ma'aseh Menorah, the purity of the self to become the chariot while doing the work through that Kavanot to order the temple through the lights that are drawn down as exemplified in the menorah. The process of creating the proper vessels to rightly contain and disseminate that light. And it is the light of the wisdom of realizing that it is the choshech that is the or, the darkness that is the light, the or hakadus. To be able to see that, one must be illuminated by the divine lights of the menorah, with the oil that is wisdom, the oil that is the chokhmah of Abba, the hidden wisdom of Abba, that is received by Bina as Ima Ila'ah, the Rechem, the womb space, through which the Mohim are shaped and birthed, as they are transmitted through the Yesod channel, which would then be the knobs of the menorah. And the flowers of the flower design of the menorah represents the flowering, the blossoming, the harvesting of the fruits of Malkut. Again, from Malkut into Malkut, all light is received, and from Malkut, all of the fruits are born. One moment, someone's coming in the room. I think someone tried to enter. One moment, please. Okay, again, Total above for everyone's patience. I will be off camera momentarily with the baby. I thank you for understanding. And when we speak of Maaseh Menorah, the working of the menorah, the intentions and what we are to see, even about the encoded secret of the Shabbat, the proper ordering of the times and the calendars through the configuration of the menorah, what we are supposed to see through this illumination of its lights is also tied greatly to the humility that is the requisite for purity, the malleability. When speaking of the menorah, we understand the hammering of the gold. We understand that hammering, that pressure, that pounding, that beating is, instead of being seen as gerura, some type of punishment or restriction, it is a chesed. It is mercy. The mercy of purification, softening, making one light as gold. The purer the gold, the lighter it is, the softer it is, the more malleable, the more moldable, shapeable. Zahav tahor. And Bezalel made the menorah of pure gold. Of hammered work, he made the menorah, its base and its shaft. And when we recite Pitum HaKetoret, we actually recite this 7 times, once for each of the Sefirot. And this is because this configuring and shaping and even hammering of this menorah is representing the rectification of the 7 Sefirot to merit the reception of the 7 flows of Shefa. This is part of the kavanot, the intentionality, the mindfulness that should be in your recitation of Pitum HaKetoret. To receive the benefit of the flowers, the fruits of chesed, the charity. It even brings to mind, if we think of Malkut as Shekinah, as the Shabbat bride, it even makes me think of the charity, the chesed in the West, when the bride throws the flowers, or sometimes guests will throw fruit at a wedding. And so every Shabbat and every feast, we're also, again, celebrating that Yikud of Tiferet and Malkut, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Shekinah, the Zah and the Nukva, and benefiting from the fruits of that union through the proper structure of the dissemination of the Or Ein Sof, the Mohin, the oil as that wisdom of Abba, received by that cup. Also, keep in mind, this is Yod He Vav He. The Abba to Ima, to Zianampin, to Nukva. And back again, back to that figure 8, that eternal circuit of never ceasing flow. And even as we evoke the name here, we also know that this is why after each counting of Sefirat HaOmer, which we are immersed in this season, we recite Tehillim 67 and Ana Bekoach, evoking those 7 names, those 7 dimensions. It's always about that work, that divine work of completion, rectifying and strengthening the vessels, sweetening and perfuming the vessels. And in Parsha Emor, the menorah portion is in the same section as we read about Lechem HaPanim, the bread of the face, as well as the man who some say cursed the name of God, but others affirm that it is the sages who elucidate that he did not curse the name, he used the name, the Shem HaMeforesh. So juxtaposing these portions, Ma'aseh Menorah as the rebuilding of a sanctified temple as the self, as Malkut, as earth, as the universe, in rectification as the Vav and the He are in reconciliation, reunification. This work juxtaposed with Lechem HaPanim, the 12 loaves, and the use of the Shem HaMeforesh, connecting again mouth and speech and consumption, even other forms of Yichud. Because even to speak Shem HaMeforesh, to speak a name that enacts the creation of something, an event, an outcome, there's a Yichud. There's a Yichud of the name in its configuration. And the 12 loaves representing the 12 Partsufim in the pantheon, 6 pairs who are in Yichud, who are in Zivug. Zivug Panim Be Panim, Ze'er Anpin and Nukva. All going back to consumption and creation simultaneously. The mouth as a portal of creation, as well as a portal of consumption, devouring, to eat. Chief Rabbi Pinchas spoke from the Bantu cosmological perspective, even about certain forces, the Kindoki forces that can eat people. And all throughout the diaspora, we have this same concept, this same terminology when we're speaking about malevolent forces or malevolent people, people who will eat you through certain forms of magic or witchcraft, however people choose to speak about it. But ultimately, it's about the mind, it's about the mouth, it's about the ayin hara, the evil eye that sees something through a distorted lens that creates some type of envy or judgment. And then what is seen manifesting as a desire in the heart to be enacted through the words of the mouth, the lashon hara, the evil tongue. And that same mouth that speaks judgments and brings harshness on a person is the mouth that will eat them, to drain them, to leech them, or even as yinika, to nurse from them. So there's a difference between eating, devouring, to drain life and light force and life force from someone, or to consume as an act of unification for divine bitul and birur, to extract and elevate the sparks through that yikud that is occurring in the body. And with the lechem panim on the table, that light of Order Himself has condensed into material form. So when we eat the bread, when we receive our daily bread, when we receive our bread, our Shabbat bread, we receive with gratitude that Order Himself. It is a physical manifestation of the Mohim that we are calling down through the sanctification of Shabbat, the sanctification of the times. the mitzvot, the kavanot. And likewise, even as we receive this light in the form of this lechem, which is also a form of shefa, we simultaneously draw out and release and elevate the divine lights or sparks that were trapped in the food itself. So the Or Ein Sof becomes mochin, becomes even wisdom, to become that light that is fixed into a form of physical nourishment, physical sustenance, as one is sustained by the wisdom and the light of Ein Sof. And this table that one eats at represents the sadeh, the field, makut, chachal tapuchin kadeshim, the field of sacred apples. But we must also be sanctified as that field, as that makut, as that receptacle, that receptive vessel, as we receive that shefa. When the body is pure, like the Kohanim are called to be pure, rectifying the sanctification of the times, even through, again, speech, the power of the mouth, the portal of creation by the declaration, a time, even the Hagim, the Moadim, are declared and witnessed. The Beit Din declare the times of the Moadim. There was a whole teaching on that in the rabbinical program. And the witnessing, like the Edot, to tie into the Nida Limudim that we've been exploring. The idea of the Edot Berikat, the witnessing, the one who goes out, the testimony of the Molad. So the cosmos, the halal, the Shekinah's dwelling place, that mercy seat, that sanctuary, this is all that field during Shabbat. And through the intentions of fixing the times, through the Moadim, we hope through our purification to create that reality where every day is Shabbat, in that divine balance, unity, and rectification. Because of Hashem. And so to come back to finish out the text, what is particularly striking is that sexual wrongdoing is often understood not as an individual fault, but as a relational impurity. It introduces falsehood, shame, jealousy, and mistrust. It weakens trust, which is the very fabric of the household and the community. Thus, it is not only the individual who is affected, but the entire network of relationships in which that person is embedded. The consequences follow this logic. What is affected is inner stability, the strength of the couple, whether monogamous or polygamous, according to Torah frameworks, the honor of the lineage, and spiritual balance. A household may lose its place. A family may fall into conflict. A person may lose clarity and strength. All of this is understood as a result of a disorder introduced into the living system of relationships. In response, the Nusach Afriki approach is rarely purely punitive. It is primarily restorative. The goal is not simply to condemn, but to realign the person with what is right. This begins with self-mastery, learning to govern one's desires rather than being governed by them. But this mastery is not isolated. It is supported by the community, by education, by elders, and by clear frameworks. The essential dimension is repair. When disorder has been introduced, it must be acknowledged, truth must be spoken, what has been broken must be repaired, and relationships must be restored. In some cases, this may involve practices of reconciliation or purification, whose purpose is to reharmonize the individual with themselves, with others, and with the unseen world. A fundamental principle emerges. A fundamental principle emerges: the return to truth. In this worldview, sexual immorality thrives in secrecy, deception, and duplicity. Healing, therefore, requires a life that is clear, aligned, and coherent. To live in truth is to be properly positioned within the order of the world. In summary, Bantu Israelite cosmology does not frame the issue in abstract moral terms, but in terms of harmony or rupture within the vital order. Sexuality is a creative force. When rightly directed, it builds life and strengthens bonds. When misdirected, it weakens the individual, the household, the lineage, and the relationship with the invisible. The central challenge is therefore to remain aligned with what sustains life, connection, and balance. This posture, linking language, spirituality, natural cycles, and identity, constitutes a major level of liberation for Black people, provided it is carried out with rigor and clarity. Liberation first unfolds on an identity level through deep cultural and spiritual reclamation. By rediscovering their own systems of thoughts, Okay. I believe you all are still seeing the screen. By rediscovering their own systems of thought, individuals free themselves from dependence on imported frameworks and no longer define their relationship to the divine or to time through external categories. This process generates a true mental liberation by overcoming the modern fragmentation that separates body, mind, and nature. By restoring coherence between the lunar cycle, bodily rest, and the act of prayer, one recovers existential stability and an inner unity essential to any form of emancipation. On the spiritual level, highlighting the shared root between Nzambi, Ein Sof Baruchu, Sambo, the cycle of seven, and Kosambela, to pray, enables a direct and unmediated reconnection to the divine, freeing the soul from exclusive dependence on external religious institutions. Finally, this posture offers a practical form of liberation by establishing healthy rhythms of life that respect biological limits and prevent collective exhaustion. However, this reconstruction must remain grounded and critical in order to avoid the pitfalls of essentialism or unverified absolute claims. Because true strength lies in the union of restored memory and intellectual rigor. The dialogue between Rabbinic Torah and the Bantu Israelite wisdom, understood as preceding it, acts as a powerful catalyst for this restoration, transforming how a people perceives its place in the universe. This, as a side note, this is also alluding to the importance of our daily times of prayer. For saying the the times for saying the shacharit, the mincha, the arvit, even the kriyat shema, certainly tikkun chatzot, keeping in mind the Congo cosmogram, the Dikanga, and the times of day where there is unification, there is a yikud, the times of erev, eruv, that divine mixture and unity, that melting of day and night at the time of twilight. The names of the tetragrammaton, even the yod, the hey, the vav, and the hey, that govern these different times on the clock, these different segments of time. again in four, just like the four seasons. The seasons of the womb, even the seasons follicular, ovulatory, luteal, menstrual, keeping in mind the femininity of these cycles, these circles, these spirals, the figure eight, the infinity of this divine simultaneity, the undulations of renewal, rest, reflection, renewal, action, rising, yashar. All of these are embedded and encoded in that Congo cosmogram, that Dikenga, not only on a weekly level, not only on a seasonal level with the Moadim, but also even on a daily level with our times of prayer, confession, reflection, introspection, intentionality. Liberation begins with a form of textual validation. Upon discovering that the prohibition of work on the new moon appears in the Hebrew prophets, Black people can recognize that their ancestral tradition is not a folkloric curiosity, but the remnant of a universal truth. The number 7 then moves from being a symbol to becoming a force of action. By linking the biblical Shabbat with the Bantu Israelite Sambo, rest becomes a strategy of political and metaphysical reconnection, enabling a people to resist exploitation through mastery of its own time. Likewise, the resonance between the exodus at the full moon and the status of spiritual fullness attributed to the moon in African wisdom teaches that freedom must be synchronized with the laws of the cosmos. This dialogue also establishes an ethic of non-injury toward creation, in which the rest of the land ensures sustainable territorial sovereignty. Ultimately, this encounter enables the reconstruction of a unified self, ending the division between biblical faith and ancestral roots. By recognizing that the categories of Shabbat and the cycles of the moon are two expressions of the same divine science, Black people move from being perceived as outsiders in the history of global spirituality to reclaiming their place among its original guardians. For it is in this recovered legitimacy that true freedom is born. Percussion. Hold on, Rabam. Let me get back to my meet window. Shalom, shalom. Total Rabbi for your time, for your patience. And we will conclude the Limud here. And this is also a great time to plug Chief Rabbi Pentecost's book, Political Traditionalism, or Rethinking the Manifesto of Insele. So if you don't have it already, I highly recommend obtaining that powerful piece, especially as we just read about that idea of being synchronized with these universal laws, these cosmic laws, being in synergy and in harmony with the seasons of nature, the cycles of the moon, being one with creation, all of creation. That is our Shema, that is our Echad. Understanding Ein Sof within everyone and everything, and thus that we likewise are in everyone and everything. And thus we love our neighbor as ourself. There's no separation, there's no othering, including with nature. There's nothing even outside of ourselves that is not inside ourselves. Every element, every mineral, even the very gold that we spoke of, Zahav Tahor, the hammering of the menorah, is all in our bodies. Every mineral, every metal, every element, every crystal configuration, even stardust is in our bodies. And charging that chashmal, that divine, truly divine electromagnetic power of our melanin, our black body radiation. And so we must be one with creation and the cosmos, and even returning to these ancestral secrets, this ancestral wisdom of how to treat the land and how the land itself should rest, ensuring sustainable territorial sovereignty as part of the liberation of our people as a whole. Returning to the roots, literally, the ancestral roots, the roots of the land. Malkut. We're all talking about Malkut. This is all about the rectification of Shekinah, whose sanctuary was defiled, desecrated. The land itself, the mother. So when we return to this wisdom, when we return to this oneness, that is powerfully not only political, but revolutionary. And indeed, literally revolutionary, as revolution speaks of cycles. So we return to that hidden wisdom, that feminine wisdom of cycles and seasons and divine simultaneity, infinity and immortality. What they say on Bebe's Kids, we don't die, we multiply. So we have to make life sustainable and make the vessels fortified for the holy sparks and the ancestors to continue to be born into this world and continue to rectify this world through the nobility of the tradition of this Torah that we keep. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen. Toda Rabbi, everyone, for joining. Toda Rabbi, Rabbinate Yocheved. Toda Rabbi, Rabbi Ariel. Toda Rabbi, Rabbinate Shula. Shavua Tov. See you all next week. That's our mission.